So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Maya Van Rossum. I'm the Delaware Riverkeeper, leader of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And I want to welcome you all to this evening's webinar. We are here to talk about new proposed water quality standards that the US EPA has put forth in order to protect aquatic life in the Delaware River. This evening, we're going to have 4 speakers, all from the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. Myself, I'm going to start with a few slides about how we got to this moment. We're then going to hear from Casey Manahan, who is Senior Legal Counsel with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. We're going to then hear from Dr. Eric Sildorf. He's our Senior Scientist at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And then we're going to hear from Annika Van Rossum, who is Advocacy and Policy Coordinator with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and is very involved in this dissolved oxygen work, as well as the work to protect the Atlantic sturgeon. Tonight, we are going to go over what the EPA is actually proposing, why it's proposing this, whether or not it's a good proposal or a bad proposal or somewhere in between, and how you can weigh in on this really critical issue when it comes to protecting the Delaware River, the Delaware Estuary, and aquatic life in the river. I want you to know that at the end of our presentations, we are not going to have a question and answer session. We are in the midst of a dynamic public comment period. This is a critical issue that the Delaware Riverkeeper Network has been working on for about a decade and a half. We know that industry, that wastewater operators, and that other members of the opposition are watching this evening because they want to know what we have to say about this. So we want to make sure that we're bringing forth a body of information and knowledge that informs the general public about what's being proposed and gives you, I think, a solid sense of whether or not this is good or bad or what needs to be modified in order to properly protect our beautiful Delaware Estuary. But we're being careful about what we're providing at this time because we are still in the process of doing our scientific analysis, our legal analysis, and developing the more robust position that the Delaware Riverkeeper Network is taking on this. So we're just going to share with you the good information that we have at this point, and we may have more opportunities down the line to share more in-depth information, but knowing who is watching and wanting to make sure that we make positive progress on this issue, we've decided not to have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar presentation. So why now? Why is this happening now? Well, it's happening now for a couple of reasons. First off, it's happening now because it has to. We have some pretty perilous conditions during critical times of the year in the Delaware Estuary that are having serious and significant ramifications on aquatic life in the estuary, particularly the Delaware River's genetically unique population of Atlantic sturgeon. The Atlantic sturgeon in the Delaware River are found nowhere else on Earth but in our beautiful Delaware River in terms of their full life cycle. They depend upon good quality dissolved oxygen levels in their river systems in order to support all aspects of their lives. If there's not enough oxygen, it has deep and significant impacts on the population. At this point, there are less than 250 spawning adults left that come into the Delaware River in any given year of our genetically unique population of Atlantic sturgeon. So they are very literally on the brink of extinction, and they need us to do anything and everything we can to protect them and to help restore their numbers. And one of the most important things we can do is make sure that they have enough oxygen to support their bodies and their life cycle. Just like we, the people, need oxygen, so too do our Atlantic sturgeon and other aquatic life in the estuary that are also being impacted by low dissolved oxygen conditions. But the Atlantic sturgeon is one that's suffering at particularly severe levels. We're also here in this moment because the Delaware River Basin Commission and the state regulatory agencies have fundamentally failed us. They have failed to do what is necessary to ensure protection of oxygen levels for the aquatic life of the Delaware Estuary. For a very long period of time, over a decade and a half, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, joined by other partners, have been urging and advocating for the Delaware River Basin Commission and the states to take critical action to protect water quality and dissolved oxygen levels for the benefit of the sturgeon and other aquatic life. And frankly, they fundamentally failed us. And so the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, partner organizations, and advocates who care about our river and our aquatic life have now turned to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to do the job, and they are rising to the challenge. I want you to know how long this process has actually been going on. It was back over a decade ago, in March of 2013, that the Delaware River Keeper Network, the Delaware River Shad Fishermen's Association, and the Lehigh River Stocking Association got together and crafted a petition that we submitted to the Delaware River Basin Commission and through them to the state regulatory agencies, urging them to take action to protect dissolved oxygen in the Delaware Estuary at appropriate levels, to put in place critical legal protections that would ensure oxygen levels were properly protected in our Delaware Estuary. At that time, we amassed a tremendous body of science to support our request, and it was all laid out in this detailed petition. The response from the DRBC was, nope, sorry, can't do anything. We need to do more research, more study, even though we had laid out so much science already in this petition. And so they and others proceeded to do more research and more study in the coming years. And every single analysis that came out, every single significant analysis that came out just reaffirmed that oxygen levels in the estuary at certain critical times were not high enough to protect the aquatic life of the estuary, were certainly not high enough for our genetically unique population of Atlantic sturgeon, that existing water quality standards were not doing the job of ensuring critical protections of this fundamental, basic life necessity of the aquatic life of the river. And so the Delaware Riverkeeper Network once again embarked on the crafting of a petition, amassing the new science with the science that we already had. We were joined by 16 other organizations, and we submitted this petition again to the Delaware River Basin Commission and through them to the states, and urging them to take swift and meaningful action. There was a lot of advocacy and action and activity, but this petition was a fundamentally important next step in all of that work. And the response was really disappointing. Frankly, we got a lot of foot dragging, we got a lot of excuses, but worse than that, we had a tremendous misrepresentation of the facts and the science that were at play around this issue. And it became very, very clear to us at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and our partner organizations that the Delaware River Basin Commission and the states were not going to step up and do what was needed to save the Atlantic sturgeon from extinction and to protect the other aquatic life of the Delaware Estuary that is so important to our beautiful river and to all of us who care about and depend upon the river. And so another group of us got together and crafted a petition based on the Clean Water Act that we submitted to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in April of 2022, urging the EPA to overstep the DRBC, to overstep the states, to take control, to take charge, and to put in place the critical protections that our estuary, our aquatic life, and our Atlantic sturgeon needed. Again, this petition went into the US EPA in April of 2022. And before the year was out, the US EPA responded that they agreed with us that it was important for them to take this step. And they approved our request that they step in and take the leadership role in ensuring appropriate water quality standards were put in place to address the dissolved oxygen issues in the Delaware Estuary in order to protect all of the life stages of critical species. And they promised us that they were going to put forth draft regulations that we could review and comment on, and that they could then put in place, that they would do that within a year. And you know what? They did. Just a year and a couple of weeks after their first approval, right on schedule, they issued the draft water quality standards that we are here tonight to talk about. It's a powerful and important moment. This is a powerful and important opportunity to put in place critical protections that we, the people, have been urging for the aquatic life of the Delaware River that is so, so important to our watershed and to our communities. With that, I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to turn it over to Senior Attorney Casey Manahan to talk a little bit about the legal fundamentals.
Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm going to explain some of the legal origins of this action, what are water quality standards, and how did this proposed rule come to be. So as you heard Maya explain, this was our request of EPA was under the Clean Water Act, and Section 101A2 of the Clean Water Act states the goal of that legislation, which is it's a federal law. And the goal is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, and to achieve the goal of water quality, which provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation in and on the water. And so Section 303 of that law describes water quality standards, which are really the backbone of the Clean Water Act. And often water quality standards are set by the states, all the various states across the country. A water quality standard has two parts. One is the use, and the second is the criteria that protects the use. So, for example, the two biggest category of uses are referred to as aquatic life uses, which you can see were detailed in the goals of the Clean Water Act, and also recreational uses, which is the second major goal of the Clean Water Act. And then criteria are the measurement by which those uses are protected. So sometimes they are narrative in nature, describing there can't be an oily sheen on the water, or there can't be a certain amount of solid pieces of trash floating in the water, or they can be numeric. And in this case, these proposed dissolved oxygen criteria are numeric. And any criteria need to be based on sound scientific rationale. So based on science, not what is, not any other factor like economics or anything like that. So water quality, as I said before, water quality standards are typically set by states, but in the Delaware River Basin Commission sets the criteria for the interstate waters. And you can see here the area that we're talking about. We have Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware surrounding the Delaware River and the estuary. The basin states refer to, in their regulations, their water quality standard regulations, they refer to and incorporate DRBC's current dissolved oxygen criteria, which is from 1967. So as Maya explained, we petitioned EPA to use its authority under Clean Water Act Section 303C4B, which says that the EPA, when necessary, can determine that updated water quality standards are necessary to satisfy the requirements of the Clean Water Act. And here, that is the propagation of aquatic life and the criteria necessary to protect propagation. So the proposed rule from EPA, it revises the designated use. As I mentioned before, that's one half of what a water quality standard is. So it revises the designated use for Pennsylvania's and New Jersey's water quality standards, which previously did not include propagation in the part of the Delaware River Estuary that is subject to this proposed rule. The state of Delaware did have propagation already as a use, but for all three states, it proposes to revise the corresponding criteria for all three. So the numeric criteria to protect the propagation use. And also, another important law that comes into play here, the Endangered Species Act, because Atlantic and Shortnose sturgeon, which are some of the most sensitive species to low dissolved oxygen levels, they're both protected under the Endangered Species Act. So the EPA, when they're setting this standard, they have to also consult with NOAA Fisheries, or formerly known as NIMFS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, to ensure that water quality standards will not jeopardize the continued existence of these species or result in the destruction or adverse modification of their critical habitat. And the Delaware River is designated critical habitat for Atlantic sturgeon. So to talk a little bit more about the science of these proposed criteria, I'm going to hand it off to Eric Dildorf.
And thank you everyone for joining us. This is a monumental step and really exciting to see what's happening and the possibilities here for the Delaware Estuary. As Casey was just mentioning, the first really important and major step forward here is that for the first time ever, or the first time that water quality standards were used in the Delaware River, the entire Delaware River will have the propagation use included for everyone and everywhere, for Camden, for Philly, for Chester, for Wilmington, just as it does in the upper parts of the Delaware River. And so this is something that's been missing. The pollution that has resulted over the last 100 years has impaired that aquatic life use. And now we are saying that the goal and the designated use for all parts of the Delaware River are now fully compliant with Section 101A2 goals of the Clean Water Act. And so this is one of the biggest parts of EPA's proposal, is that we are finally about to cross that threshold, the threshold that frankly, many people said was not possible, and that the propagation was not something that ever could be designated for the Delaware River. So again, first part of this major step forward by EPA's proposal. The second is that EPA's proposal is both innovative and site-specific. EPA is using the best and most current science. It's using some really interesting statistical tools and some models of the Atlantic Sturgeon, and specifically using them for the Delaware River to develop site-specific criteria for the Delaware River. So that's an important part and one of the strengths of the proposed criteria for EPA. Third, the criteria are almost entirely based on Atlantic sturgeon. It is well recognized by most folks who are studying the Delaware River that Atlantic sturgeon are the species that are the most sensitive to the low dissolved oxygen or hypoxia that exists in the Delaware River. And they have their life stage. They are hatching eggs at the beginning of summer in late May or early June. And those eggs and larval fish and young juvenile fish have to live in this very sensitive time of their life through those warmest months of the year, June, July, August, September. And because of that really high sensitivity, they are at risk from being severely harmed by low oxygen levels or completely eliminated in terms of a year class. And so the new criteria that EPA are proposing are largely based on that sensitivity, with the assumption being that if we can write dissolved oxygen criteria that protect Atlantic sturgeon, we protect all of the other species that are living in the estuary and that are being impacted currently by the hypoxic conditions that we see every single year in the estuary. And it's worth emphasizing that this is not some kind of paper chase. This is not some kind of just formality in terms of crossing it off the list on some report, but that we are actually seeing hypoxic, stressful oxygen conditions every year from Philly and Camden down through Chester, down to Wilmington. And so this is really meaningful. And by writing those criteria to protect Atlantic sturgeon, we are protecting all of those species that are being impaired by that low oxygen we see every year. And the final thing that is important in EPA's proposal is that it essentially is requiring a single step that we've known about for at least 40 years, which is that our major wastewater treatment plants in the Delaware Estuary have not implemented a very simple and conventional treatment process called nitrification. Nitrification takes ammonia and converts it to nitrite and nitrate so that when that nitrogen is discharged into the estuary, it doesn't consume oxygen in the estuary. And this was acknowledged all the way back in 1967. As Casey was saying, the current standards date back to 1967. And even back in the 1960s, folks were talking about when to implement nitrification. I don't think anybody back in 1967 would have thought that over 50 years later, we'd still be talking about whether or not to implement this. Again, it's a conventional treatment process. Most folks that are on this call probably have a wastewater treatment plant in their community that has already implemented nitrification. And essentially, that's what EPA proposal is calling for in terms of change of policy, is for these wastewater treatment plants to start using the oxygen in their wastewater treatment plant instead of using the oxygen and consuming that out in the Delaware River. Let's take a quick look then at the criteria themselves. This is from the fact sheet that EPA issued along with the formal rulemaking, so it's a little bit cleaner summary of those criteria. We're not going to go into all of the details of all the aspects and the derivation of these criteria, but we did want to highlight this table which summarized the criteria and some of the aspects of it. The first thing is it divides the year into 3 different seasons, each season being 4 months, largely based on Atlantic sturgeon biology, but more broadly based on some of the different phenologies out in the Delaware River. So it's March, April, May, and June as the first season, and then a summer into fall season, July, August, September, and October, and then finally a cold water season, November through February. The second component of the criteria is that instead of designating numeric criteria for oxygen, the way that most of us are used to seeing it in terms of concentration of oxygen or milligrams per liter of oxygen, it's designating the criteria the way that the fish and the freshwater mussels and the aquatic insects, the way that they feel oxygen in the estuary, which is the percent of oxygen saturation. So it's a gas constant about how well oxygen is dissolved in the water and the partial pressures of that oxygen relative to the standard of 100% saturation or equilibrium with the atmosphere. And what we see is a single criterion that's consistent across the entire year of 66% oxygen saturation that is applicable from March through June, through October, and then through the cold water season. But then a second oxygen saturation, which is a 74% oxygen saturation. And these criteria are pretty complex and they're not trivial. There are different percentages of saturation and there are different percentages of time that those standards are met. So it's often confusing because we're talking percentages of percentages. But the other part of each of these numbers is that they are associated with a percentile or a percent of time that those criteria are met. So the 66% saturation is associated with the 10th percentile, meaning that 10% of the time oxygen is allowed to be below that standard, and everyone's going to agree that that's still fine. But 90% of the time, oxygen has to be above that standard for the time period that is designated as a season. The one criterion that is not a 10th percentile, but is instead a median or 50th percentile, is that 74% oxygen saturation that applies just during what EPA is calling the juvenile development season of July, August, September, and October. So 4 months where a second standard applies, saying that the typical day out in the estuary during those 4 months needs to be about 74% saturation. Half the days can be below that, and half the days can be above that. And so that's the second standard and the how those are related to percentiles in the oxygen distribution. So pretty wonky, kind of interesting way to do it, but also pretty innovative for EPA to both be using oxygen saturation and then using percentiles for deriving these criteria. The duration is the averaging over which the criteria are assessed. And here you'll see that every single one of these criteria are a daily average, meaning that something that's missing from the EPA criteria is that there is no instantaneous requirement for certain dissolved oxygen conditions. Instead, oxygen fluctuates through the day as the algae and plants photosynthesize and release oxygen into the water, so that oxygen typically is higher in the afternoon and lower first thing in the morning. And these criteria are averaging that out and saying we are only considering an average. This is a little bit of a limitation because that is not what the fish and the aquatic organisms like freshwater mussels and aquatic insects feel. They're actually feeling instantaneous oxygen, so this is a little bit of a mismatch. The other thing that's somewhat problematic, and I'll talk more about this in a couple of slides, is the number of days that you're allowed to violate those criteria. And you can see for the 10th percentile, that means that you can violate the criteria 12 days across a 4-month season, or for the median, you can violate it half of the days, right? Half the days are above that criteria and half are below. But this is particularly problematic because all 12 of those violations could be stacked on top of each other. and lead to a severely critical time for the organisms living in the estuary. So that's a brief summary about what the EPA criteria include in terms of their proposal. Let's talk briefly about, since the Atlantic sturgeon are the center of these criteria, let's talk a little bit about what the Atlantic sturgeon research tells us of the oxygen needs for these really amazing creatures, although ancient, 200 million years old in terms of their evolution, and very sensitive to low oxygen, not just for our Atlantic sturgeon, but for the entire group of sturgeon throughout the world. So there has been a lot of research that's been done over the last 25 years on the oxygen needs for Atlantic sturgeon in particular, but for all of the sturgeons worldwide. There are two important points here about how their oxygen needs vary. The first thing is that it is temperature dependent, that as these fish become stressed with high water temperatures, their ability to tolerate lower oxygen or to tolerate hypoxia goes down. So that in the range of about 25 to 28 degrees centigrade, I probably should have converted that to Fahrenheit. 25 C is going to be about 77 degrees Fahrenheit, so a pretty typical summer water temperature out in the Delaware River. That's when the hypoxic conditions or the depressed oxygen is particularly bad for their survival, the growth, and all of the functions for Atlantic sturgeon. And then in terms of how bad it gets, we see elevated mortality as well as non-lethal effects in the range of about 60% saturation to 70% saturation. And so you'll notice the overlap there, that's one of the EPA proposed criteria, is to allow 10% of the time oxygen to be below 66% saturation, even during the summer months when water temperatures are in the 25 to 28 degree centigrade range. What the research tells us in terms of safe conditions is that as oxygen saturation gets up to about 80 to 85% saturation, even at those really warm temperatures, 25, 28, even 30 degrees centigrade, that those saturations then are tolerable for Atlantic sturgeon when they also have the stress of either higher salinities, which you would see further down in the Delaware Estuary, or the high temperatures of summer. So we really need to see dissolved oxygen conditions during summer, typically in the 80 to 85% range. And finally, to convert that back to the type of criteria that we are typically used to seeing in state standards and federal standards, is that 80 to 85% saturation roughly translates to about 6.5 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen in terms of concentration of dissolved gas in the water. And this is consistent with the original DRN request back in 2013, so over 10 years ago. First request to the Delaware River Basin Commission was that DRBC set a standard at 6.5 milligrams per liter to protect Atlantic sturgeon. And of course, it has taken too long for anyone to take action on that. And so we're really excited that EPA is finally taking action and proposing improvements to these standards. There are three ways, however, that we think that the EPA proposal comes up a little bit short. The first is, and I mentioned it when we were looking at that table for EPA criteria, is that there is no instantaneous minimum dissolved oxygen. There is no bottom floor below which we do not allow oxygen to go before we raise a red flag and say, hey, there's a problem out there. And that's a problem because this is physiologically how the fish feel oxygen. It's how other aquatic organisms like freshwater mussels feel the oxygen. It is instantaneously, and it's a typical part of criteria. And so it's something that is missing from the EPA criteria and needs to be added. The second shortcoming in the EPA criteria is that those oxygen saturation thresholds of 66% saturation as a 10th percentile and 74% saturation as a median or 50th percentile are just too low. They're good, but they're not good enough. They do not represent fully protective thresholds for Atlantic sturgeon and for all of the aquatic life in the Delaware Estuary. And finally, the last point is that the assessment window is really set up too long. We understand EPA's motivation for looking at 4-month time periods to develop the models, figure out the biology behind the sturgeon needs for oxygen. But when translating that then into assessment, we need to be looking at shorter time periods so that we don't run the risk of taking all 12 of those days that we allow violations of, for instance, that 10th percentile, that 66% saturation that EPA is proposing, having all 12 of those days occur in 1 month, for instance, the month of July or the month of oxygen, in which case you could eliminate essentially all of the young of year sturgeon in a given year. And indeed, since 2009, we have seen such severe oxygen stress in the Delaware Estuary that essentially an entire year class of these endangered species have been eliminated by this hypoxia. So it's not just a theoretical risk, it's a real risk. We have been seeing it over the last 15 years. So these assessment windows need to be shorter to make sure that we don't stack up a really long period of stressful conditions. And an alternative that could work would be a 1-month window in which to assess it. In addition, that 1-month window needs to include all of the warm water months. Again, we highlighted how it's the high temperature combined with the hypoxia that is particularly stressful. Right now, the more stringent criteria begin on July 1st, but certainly June is part of summer. June has those elevated temperatures in that stressful range. So we really need to be doing those 1-month assessments for May, for June, for July, for August, for September, as well as for October. So those are the periods in which we need to be assessing it. So there's a quick overview. EPA's proposal, again, is a major step forward. We are looking forward very much to EPA finalizing stronger criteria for the Delaware Estuary. We do also look to the EPA to recognize some shortcomings in those criteria and to strengthen the proposal before they finalize these criteria. So with that, let me stop and talk about how have Annika talk about how you can submit your own comments.
Great, thanks, Eric. So hi, I'm Annika Van Rossum. I'm the Delaware River Keeper Network's Advocacy and Policy Coordinator. So of course you have learned a lot of great and important information, and I hope you take it all in and you go forward with it. But really what we and the Atlantic sturgeon and the aquatic life of the Delaware River need you to do today, tomorrow, every day is provide comment to the US EPA to take this important information so that they can up these standards as we've been talking about and really provide a full and complete protection for the Atlantic sturgeon and aquatic life of the Delaware River to not just survive and make it through the threshold, but to thrive so that we can all and future generations can all enjoy a beautiful and full of life Delaware River and estuary. So you can submit public comment between now and through February 20th is the deadline. This is the link. And it should also be going in the chat in a second. So it's bit.ly/SaveTheSturgeon. It is case sensitive. So you have to enter it in correctly, or you have to enter it incorrectly. And that will take you to a page on Delaware River Keeper Network's website where we do have some information about the proposed rules. And we have given you a proposed text that you are welcome to use and copy and paste as your comment. You are also welcome to use it as guidance for whatever comment you would like to submit. So it's just what we've written and provided. So it's up to you, however you would like to use your voice to stand up for good for the river. But please get those comments in. Every single voice matters. And if you're thinking that yours doesn't, it really does. And each comment that goes in really is a tick in the box for really good, strong, robust water quality standards. And I just want to note too that make sure when you're submitting your comment that it is response into that docket ID that you see right here that is also in the action alert. And we do have a link that'll take you right to the EPA portal when you go to our webpage. So you will get right to the comment page. And then also just really important to note for you, you can do both. There are also 2 public hearings where you will have the opportunity to make oral comment to the EPA. They are both virtual. And the links are below, or you can see the dates below. February 6th from 9 to 11 a.m., February 7th from 4 to 6 p.m. You will be allotted 5 minutes for your oral comment. And the hot links to go register for those virtual hearings are also in the action alert. So if you go to that bit.ly/SaveTheSturgeon, case sensitive, you will have all the information for how to provide a comment, what to put in your comment if you'd like to use our guidance, the dates for the public hearings, and how to register for that through EPA. And of course, stay involved. This is, if you scan this QR code, it'll take you right to our membership page. Basic membership is free because we believe here at the Delaware River Keeper Network, you should not have to pay to have your voice heard and to have a say in protecting the waterway that so many of us don't just use to survive, but actually love to be out on and thrive and be a part of, and that provides so much essential beauty and health for us. So please, 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 if you came here this way because you are a member, then I encourage you to go send this to another person, maybe one other person in your life, and encourage them to be a member, so that we here too can grow and continue to create a beautiful, active, sustaining community to be a loud and powerful voice for our Delaware River. So I encourage you to become a member, stay involved, and we have not just great webinars about sturgeon, but we did a great event last year where we had a funeral to protect the sturgeon. We had the last baby shower. So we may have some more cool events that you might want to be a part of to have your voice heard. But yeah, so stay involved. Please make those comments. Please go to that link and do that comment, maybe right after this webinar. And with that, I will turn it back over to Maya Van Rossum, the Delaware River Keeper.
Great. Thanks, Casey. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Annika, for those great presentations. And more importantly, thank you to everybody who tuned in today to learn from this important webinar. We are at this incredible moment of opportunity because people came together, lifted up their voices, and advocated for our beautiful Delaware River, for the aquatic life in the river, and for our genetically unique population of Atlantic sturgeon that are so close to being lost to all of us, including future generations. So if we can come together once again right now in support of EPA's leadership on this critical issue, but at the same time demanding that they do better. The science urges the EPA to do more, to do better in order to provide the sturgeon and other aquatic life exactly what they need to survive and to thrive, right, in all of their life stages. This is a serious problem, as you've heard. It's a serious problem for the aquatic life of the river, but it is a serious problem with a known and accessible, implementable solution. All we need to make it happen is good, strong water quality standards put forth by the US EPA that ultimately get enforced by the federal government, the state government, and hopefully the Delaware River Basin Commission. So I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Please go to the links in the chat, the links that were on the webinar. Get active, take action, submit your comment now today, and please consider testifying at the public hearing. It's really meaningful when people come out and use their voices as well as the written word to advocate for protection and change. And with that, we're going to close out this webinar. And thank you and urge you to just please take action.